Hello, wonderful citizens of planet Earth. This is Attila Yeşilada, your favorite YouTube content creator, broadcasting for Real Turkey channel. Today, we're going to talk about Swedish membership to NATO and why Turkey is delaying ratification of this process. Our president, Mr. Erdogan, is in New York to attend the inaugural ceremonies of UN, and there he will have a chance to meet with American President Biden, where this will be the most important topic. In return for ratifying Swedish membership to NATO, Turkey will get a big reward from Biden. He will probably be able to convince the skeptical members of the Senate to approve a $20 billion F-16 sale to Turkey. Broadcast consists of three segments. First, why is Sweden and Finnish membership to NATO so important for the Ukraine war and for the broader future? Two, why Mr. Erdogan is delaying ratification? And finally, of course, how will this conflict end? Let's get started. Finland and Sweden have pursued a strict neutrality policy since the Second World War because of their proximity to Russia, but that changed with the start of the Ukraine war. Along with the Baltic nations, Finland and Sweden are justifiably afraid that Russian aggression will spill over to their countries once Ukraine is sorted out. Now, their membership is hugely important for NATO because they have a huge border with Russia. If they can build up their armies and bring them up to the standards of NATO, then they will have substantial forces at the Russian border against which Russia will have to dedicate substantial military resource just in case Sweden attacks. So I don't think that's very likely, but that's my opinion. And of course, Russia is already stretched in terms of manpower and even material at the Ukraine front. Anything that distracts them from that endeavor increases the chance of Ukraine to win the war. Usually I'm trying to be neutral when I cover a topic, but yes, I want Ukraine to win this war, defeat Russia, and regain all of its sovereign territory. As I've said, these two countries have applied for membership. Not all the NATO members were enthusiastic, except Turkey and Hungary. For different reasons, I'm not going to cover Hungary at this point. My expertise is very limited. But Turkey's objections were very clear. These two countries have become a haven for terrorists. Turkey's two nemesis, I suppose, the Gülenist terror organization and PKK, the Kurdish terror organization. And indeed, these two countries do harbor a lot of people wanted in Turkey for terrorism charges, though the definition of terrorism differs quite substantially between European jurisdictions and Turkey. Let me turn this off, the air conditioner again. In any case, Finland enacted a couple of legislative changes and other symbolic acts which allowed Mr. Erdogan to lift his veto. But the problems with Sweden continue. Mr. Erdogan promised twice in NATO summits to expedite the ratification of NATO membership through the Turkish Grand Assembly, since this is an international treaty. It needs to be approved by the Grand Assembly. And now he says, well, Sweden is yet to fulfill its obligations and it's really not in my hands because Grand Assembly is independent. What can I do? Of course, this is disingenuous. So it's important to understand why Mr. Erdogan is so reluctant to approve this membership. Several reasons come to mind. The most speculative, and for which I have no evidence, is that Putin asked Erdogan to do so. It's a weak theory simply because Finland has a bigger army and is better prepared to attack or to defend itself against Russian attack. So why not Finland and Sweden? The second reason is that Turkey really wants Sweden to extradite a larger number of fugitives, and in the absence of such a gesture, it will not ratify Swedish membership, which also sounds disingenuous because Erdogan presumably knew what Sweden can and cannot do in terms of these quote-unquote terrorists, and despite that, he promised twice that he is going to ratify the membership. The third reason is Quran burnings and insults on the Islamic prophet Muhammad, which is raising the ire of not only a Muslim nation, Turkey, but the entire Muslim world. And finally, he wants to extract more concessions from Sweden, United States, or EU before ratifying the treaty. Let's look at these reasons more carefully. As I've said, Erdogan and Putin have a very close relationship that goes beyond standard diplomatic manners, and they do a lot of favors for each other, even though they compete in different areas, such as the Caucasus and Syria. Nevertheless, he may have asked Erdogan delay the Swedish membership. Sweden has a much broader border with Russia, but Finland has a stronger army. Yeah, Swedish army is mostly voluntary and small defensive force. So while this is a possibility, I don't think that's the reason. And in fact, if it were, Mr. Erdogan would have denied outright that Turkey would approve this membership process. The terror subject is very interesting. Yes, there are a lot of, maybe dozens of Gülenist and PKK terror organization members which are resident in Sweden, given political protection in Sweden, but that doesn't necessarily mean Sweden is a haven for terrorists. The definition of terror differs greatly between the Turkish jurisdiction and the European jurisdictions. In Turkey, peaceful advocacy of a cause, also advocated by terrorist organizations, makes you a terrorist. It's called aiding and abetting. For instance, if I were to say, as long as it doesn't resort to arms or violence, PKK ought to be free to advertise Kurdish secession, or, Kurds forming their own nation is a good idea. Why don't we let them? These are not my ideas, by the way. This is not the position I hold. But I think in Western countries, this is covered under the freedom of speech, in the sense that I'm not really inciting anyone to armed violence or to rioting. In Turkey, that's considered advocacy. Aiding and abetting is not a hypothetical case. I've been put on trial for aiding and abetting PKK. I was acquitted. So, I know this to be a fact. So, in a nutshell, a lot of the people who migrated or fled to Sweden are not terrorists in Swedish jurisdiction. Moreover, in Turkey, courts are under the sway of Mr. Erdogan. They'll do whatever he says, and if Mr. Erdogan is a personal enemy, that person will be put on trial and declared a terrorist or put in prison for other reasons. In Sweden and modern world, it doesn't work like that. If a fugitive receives an extradition order, he or she has a right to appeal that in courts, and courts usually side with the defendant in these cases. So Mr. Erdogan should know that there is only so much Sweden can do in terms of returning some of these or most of these fugitives. Again, I'm not outright refusing to accept the possibility of Erdogan rejecting Swedish membership on these grounds, but I think he should have received enough briefings from his foreign policy advisors that Sweden is really doing the best it can. The third cause is these Quran burning incidents and insults on, the Muslim prophet Muhammad. Now, I watch American TV every day. Stand-up comedians make jokes, really nasty jokes about Jesus Christ. They talk against the church. They insult Bible and the Old Testament. And even though conservatives don't like that, there is very little legal action against that or social stigma for doing so. In the Muslim world, which comprises over 1 billion people out of a total planetary population of roughly 9 billion, the situation is different. Regardless of their political hues, 90%, maybe higher, ratio of Muslims would say Quran burning and insults on Muhammad are not covered under the clause of freedom of speech. These are deeply insulting, and they are, an incitement to riot. I don't take a position in this debate, to be perfectly honest with you, but I'm pointing to a dilemma that not only Sweden, but every Christian nation or modern democracy faces when dealing with the Muslim world. If you want to get along with Muslims, you gotta stop Quran burning and be careful on what people publish about our prophet, about the Muslim prophet Muhammad, because I'm not Muslim. So how do we solve this? I really don't know. I suppose these incidents can be severely restricted under the cause of disturbing peace or, causing civil disturbances or whatever. So I would admit this is not a perfect choice. In terms of Sweden, which is extremely liberal in terms of its jurisdiction, since Erdogan promised to ratify Swedish membership, these incidents proliferated. They are usually not Turks, but people from Arab nations. And of course, there is a huge domestic backlash. And it is quite possible that Mr. Erdogan's conservative allies, such as MHP, Mr. Bahçeli, or the two new allies, Kurdish Hüdapar and ultra-Islamist Yeni Refah, New Welfare, are resisting ratification. Remember, after the latest elections, AKP doesn't have a majority in the parliament to jam through legislation as it desires. And as I've said, in Turkey, regardless of its political hue, few politicians would find it advisable career-wise to ratify a treaty with a nation that is against Islam or that stokes Islamophobia. But once again, Erdogan should have sorted this out with its partners. The final theory is Erdogan wants very strong assurances from Biden that the Congress will approve the $20 billion F-16 sale before he sends the legislation for ratification to the Grand Assembly. Now, coming back, or maybe he wants something from EU. When he made a complete U-turn and announced that Turkey will support Swedish membership to NATO, he also said in return Sweden will support Turkey's cause of re-engaging with EU and help to convince EU to start negotiations on a new and expanded customs union. My latest video was about that. Turkey needs a new customs union because the current one is very disadvantageous for Turkish business people. There too, honestly, Sweden is just a member. There is a huge anti-Turkish lobby in EU, as demonstrated by the latest EU Parliament Turkey report, which was scorching in its criticism. Mostly correct, by the way. Don't tell anyone. So where do we go from here? I think Mr. Erdogan would capitulate at the end. When he talks to Biden in New York, I'm sure he will receive satisfactory guarantees to the extent it's possible that a couple of Senate members, I think led by Bob Menendez, I hope I'm not mispronouncing his first name, as a Democratic senator, who object to the F-16 sale. Now, obviously, presidents don't have full control of even their own caucus in the Congress, and I may be wrong, but this is as much as Biden will do. And in return, Erdogan will send a ratification treaty to the Grand Assembly when it officially convenes in October. This is the good case theory, in which case both sides will get what they want. Erdogan will get plaudits once again for being so pragmatic, and NATO will be expanded by two strong countries that are really beneficial for Ukraine winning the war. The worst case scenario is that Erdogan is not after extra concessions, but the Quran burning and Sweden's ostensible support for terrorism has really angered his allies, and he really doesn't have the votes to pull the legislation through. Now, that leads to a scandal. In that case, Turkey won't get F-16s for its rapidly aging air force. The relationship between Turkey and the United States would deteriorate once again. And of course, EU would not be pleased with such a decision. And whatever Erdogan hopes to get from EU will become even more difficult to achieve if Turkey, refuses to ratify membership. Even in that case, I think Erdogan does stick to his promises, and once local elections are out of the way, he'll try to jam the legislation through the parliament. But there's a huge difference between doing it in October and doing it in April. Remember, March local elections will be held in March 2014. Now, one final thing, United States does have several means to blackmail Turkey. One of them is the proliferating cases of Turkish persons and legal entities being slapped by bans on charges of helping Russia evade sanctions. I don't think these are systemic. I don't think Mr. Erdogan is involved in that. It's just that we have a huge border interceded by Black Sea, and it's very easy to smuggle things. But Biden can make the case, if worse comes to worse, that such sanctions will be broadened and may possibly be broadened to include government officials. Erdogan may capitulate. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I truly enjoy your comments. I try to answer to them as much as possible, so please keep them sending. And if you like this, subscribe or recommend it to a friend who may be interested in Turkey. This is Atilla Yeşilada saying goodbye from Syracuse, New York.